We covered the type of evidence that would indicate whether evolution is possible or not. Could it happen? Is it reasonable that this mechanism that they suggest could have produced a living cell on this planet? Now, the fossil record is the record that tells us whether it really did succeed or not. Now, I believe from the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of probability that it's able to establish, as Sir Fred Hoyle concluded, the evolutionary origin of life is impossible. But the fossil record is a history of life. It's the only history of life that we have outside of the Bible. Now, if evolution has occurred, if you and I and every living organism that now lives and has lived arose by an evolutionary process, the fossil record would show that. Because they evolved, supposedly we evolved gradually and slowly over hundreds of millions of years of time. Supposedly life evolved on this planet about 3.5 billion years ago, according to evolutionists. Beginning with a little single-cell organism like a bacterium or an amoeba. Then during the course of time we mentioned these mutations. As this little amoeba or whatever it was reproducing itself, it began to make mistakes, genetic mistakes, almost all of which were bad, but a few were good. And gradually through this process, it evolves from a single-cell organism into a multicellular organism, into the very complex invertebrates such as clams and snails and jellyfish and worms and things like that. Then one of these things evolved into a fish, whereby some invertebrate, either a soft-bodied form like a jellyfish or a worm, or something with an outer shell or exoskeleton, evolved into a vertebrate, a fish with an internal skeleton, during a period of 100 million years. And then the fish evolved into an amphibian, so fins had to change into feet and legs. The amphibian then evolved into a reptile. The reptile evolved into a bird. Means forelimbs had to change into wings, scales into feathers. Reptiles evolved into mammals, and lower mammals into primates, and then the lower primates into man. Took hundreds of millions of years of time. The number of intermediate stages would be innumerable. And the number of intermediate forms that actually lived and died during those hundreds of millions of years would number in the billions times billions. In our museums today, we have more than 250,000 different fossil species, represented by tens of millions of cataloged fossils. These fossils have been obtained, evolutionists believe, from every geological period that has ever existed. 250,000 different fossil species, a very adequate sampling of the fossil record. If evolution is true, tens of thousands of those species should be of intermediate forms, transitional forms, showing these changes actually taking place. There should be no doubt about the fact of evolution. There should be no quarrel. We would have no debate tomorrow night. Dr. Austin would not, and I would not be here this evening. There'd be no Institute for Creation Research. We'd all be evolution. The evidence would be very, very plain. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect something very different, wouldn't we? We would expect fossils of each one of the created kinds to appear fully formed right at the start. Cats would be cats, and dogs would be dogs. Tigers would be tigers. People would be people. Daisies would be daisies. Apple trees would be apple trees. We would not expect to find a gradual origin of one kind from another. Each kind was created separate and distinct and has reproduced after its own kind from the very beginning. There would be variability. Variation, yes. Many races of people. We have many varieties of dogs. People are people and dogs are dogs. No evidence that dogs and cats have come from a common ancestor. No evidence, we believe, that people and apes and monkeys have come from a common ancestor. They've been separate and distinct. Now the fossil record is able to provide the answer, whether creation or evolution is true. Now, of course, none of us were there, were we? All of these events happened in the past. They only happened once. There were no human witnesses. So all we can do is infer what may have happened. But the evidence is here. It is available whereby we may infer what may have happened. And that evidence, look, there's just simply no contest. Creation wins hands down. The record in the fossils is tremendous, powerful, positive evidence for creation. Let's take a look at some of that evidence. Now on this slide, we see reconstruction of creatures whose fossils have been found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe that these Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago, and they formed during a period of about 80 million years or more. Now that means the sediment in which we find these creatures enclosed, the rocks from which the sediment formed the rocks, that means that sediment settled out of the water a fraction of an inch per year and gradually accumulated, and somehow these organisms were trapped and became fossils. Now, I must say right away, I don't have the foggiest notion how you get fossils that way. You know, when an animal dies and floats around in the water or lies around on the ground, you don't get a fossil. The thing is completely destroyed by scavengers, by bacterial decomposition, oxidation, other chemical processes, completely destroy everything. There's nothing left. To get a fossil, the creature must be buried, and buried quickly. And even then, the chances are not very great, very slim, that it'll ever become a fossil. But it has to be buried. It must be protected from these deteriorative processes. And in the fossil record, ladies and gentlemen, we have fossil graveyards where there's billions times billions of fossils. And we have tens and tens of millions of fishes. There's one area in California, about 4 square miles, they estimate there's 1 billion fossil herring in that 4 square mile area. And we have fossil graveyards of dinosaurs and things like that. I believe that this fossil record, most of it, not all of it, but most of it was produced catastrophically at the time of the flood we read about in the Bible. Destruction and death on a tremendous scale would require a catastrophe on a tremendous scale. But however they got there, or whenever they formed, there they are. And we have fossils of sponges, fossils of jellyfish, fossils of sea urchins and trilobites, and the swimming crustacean Sydney and sea lilies, and clams and snails and brachiopods and worms and many other very, very complex invertebrates. Now, in the Precambrian rocks, rocks which generally underlie the Cambrian, rocks which evolutionists believe formed during the hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian, and rocks which evolutionists, which we know, are perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. That is, there are many Precambrian rocks perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. They are undisturbed, essentially identical with the overlying Cambrian rocks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, would you not agree that if evolution is true, if all of these tremendous variety of very complex invertebrates evolved from a little microscopic organism during hundreds of millions of years, and if we can find fossils of little bacteria and algae, little microscopic single-cell soft-bodied creatures, if we can find fossils of those creatures, we ought to find fossils of everything in between. The intermediate forms, the transitional forms, leading from that single-celled microscopic form of life to the multicellular forms of life, eventually into this great variety of very complicated invertebrates. Ladies and gentlemen, in those Precambrian rocks are found many fossils of microscopic bacteria and algae. That is, in the scientific literature today, There are reports by scientists who claim that they have found fossils of microscopic, single-celled, soft-bodied bacteria and algae in those Precambrian rocks. All right, then we certainly should have no trouble finding all the intermediates leading up to this tremendous variety of complicated invertebrates, if they have evolved. But the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, we find no transition forms. We have no ancestors for a single one of those creatures. Right at the start, a jellyfish is a jellyfish, and a sponge is a sponge, and a trilobite is a trilobite, and a sea urchin is a sea urchin. No transition form, no ancestor. I mean, there's no question about it. There's no quarrel about it. Any knowledgeable geologist knows that all of those creatures, as far as the fossil record is concerned, they just pop into existence. They may believe that they evolved, but the evidence is absolutely incompatible with that belief. Evolutionists say this is the greatest mystery in the history of life. The creation scientist says, what greater evidence for creation could the rocks give than this explosive appearance of a great variety of very highly complicated invertebrates with no ancestors? When I say explosive, I'm using the language of the evolutionary geologist. This is called the Cambrian explosion. Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen, evolution cannot be true, because we have the origin of this tremendous variety of these creatures found all over the world, and yet not one single one of those creatures can we find an ancestor. Now, furthermore, it is suggested that one of these creatures evolved into a fish. Incredible transformation. As I mentioned, they believe it took 100 million years, ladies and gentlemen. Why, there'd be billions times billions of those intermediates would have lived and died, and we ought to have millions and millions of fossils in our museum showing what evolved into a fish and the process. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have one. I mean, we don't have even one single fossil of an intermediate form. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about had its origins firmly based in nothing. And I mean nothing, absolutely nothing. There are no transition forms, no ancestors for a single fish, not even a trace. And ladies and gentlemen, again, there's no argument, there's no quarrel. No evolutionary geologist would dare to get up and try to claim that there were such fossils. Everybody knows there are no such fossils. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that settles the issue. Again, we might as well go home. The lecture's over with. We've settled the question, you see. Why? Vertebrates have no ancestors. And we are vertebrates. We're supposed to trace our origin back to fishes. Fishes have no ancestors, so we have no ancestors. And the invertebrates, they have no ancestors. And eventually we're supposed to come from one of them. So again, we have no ancestors. I have challenged evolutionists with these facts in the last dozen debates that I've had, as I will tomorrow night. If Dr. Donaldson is present tonight, he better get ready for this evidence. He better be able to explain it. How can we have 100 million years of evolution whereby one of these invertebrates was transformed into a fish, and we can't even find one single transition form? There's no way in the world you could ever explain such a thing. You just believe in evolution, you see, in spite of the scientific evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this settles it. I mean, the evidence shows beyond doubt that evolution has not occurred. There's no way geologically or any other way you can get out of this. Tremendous, powerful, positive evidence for creation. Next slide, please. But let's go. Let's take a look at some more things in the fossil record. Oh, I have a control over here, don't I, Steve? Or I'll let you control it too. All right, here we have the fish that's supposed to be the ancestor of the amphibian. And on the lower portion of the slide, we see what is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian. And I know of professors who use these as examples of transitional forms. Well, look at the fish. Why do evolutionists believe that fish was ancestral to the amphibians? Well, notice that it has some bones in the fins, which they believe could have been transformed into feet and legs of the amphibian. Of course, you notice he has several other fins which also had bones, but apparently he found some way to get rid of those, allowing these to evolve into feet and legs. Now, there's a similarity in the vertebrae. The later, and there's a similarity there, but the later amphibians have totally different kind of vertebrae. Just blows it out of the water. But also there's a similarity in the pattern of bones in the skull. Now that's supposed to prove or give strong evidence that this fish was the ancestor of that amphibian. But ladies and gentlemen, please look. What do you see in that fish? You see a fish, 100% fish, with a lovely set of fins designed for balancing, steering, and locomotion into water. What do you see here? The basic amphibian limb, feet and legs. Not a trace of an intermediate. Now furthermore, look at the pelvic bone of the fish. Very small, loosely embedded in muscle. No attachment to the vertebral column. Well, none is needed. The fins do not support the weight of the body. But look at the pelvic bone of the amphibian. It's very large and firmly anchored to the vertebral column. You see, that's the kind of anatomy you must have for this four-legged locomotion. Those fins could not support the weight of the body, not at all, you see. And not a trace of an ancestor or intermediate form. The next slide, we see an exhibit in the Chicago Museum of Natural History. Here, of the transformation of fish into an amphibian. Here we see the fish, there we see the amphibian, and sure enough, in between we have a strange intermediate form, part fish and part amphibian. But if you read the fine print under that transitional form, you would find that he's labeled inferred intermediate. Inferred indeed is strictly imaginary. No one has ever found such an intermediate form. It's not in the Chicago Museum, it's not in the British Museum, it's not in the American Museum, it's not in the Los Angeles History Museum. There are none. The scientists could not produce it, so they had the artist produce it. But that's not science, that's artistic license. And furthermore, it's an admission of failure. You can bet that if they had one transitional form, it'd be right there. But they have to put in the inferred intermediate. Now, flight, of course, is remarkable. And to convert a non-flying animal into a flying animal would really require a revolution in structure. And it is supposed that flight has evolved 4 times independently. And each process took millions of years of time. So we have multiplied opportunities to find transitional forms, if evolution is true. And so it should be a nice test case of creation versus evolution. If creation is true, the positive evidence for creation would be the sudden appearance of each kind without any evidence of a transformation. Well, here we have a dragonfly, one of the flying insects that we have today, supposedly evolved from a non-flying insect. I'm not saying it evolved from an ant, but here is a fossil ant, supposed to be 30 or 40 million years old, found in amber. And we can see it's an ant. Now they found not long ago a fossil collection of insects which included daddy longlegs, spiders, mites, centipedes, and things like that. The scientists said, why, they're so perfectly preserved. It looked like they just died yesterday. Well, I think that's a lot closer than the 350 million years that they put on them. Just think, perfectly preserved, and they've supposedly been there for 350 million years. But what were they? They were spiders and mites and daddy longlegs and centipedes and things like that. And they found some fossil cockroaches, supposed to be about 350 million years or older. The scientists who studied them said they look disgustingly similar to modern cockroaches. They were just cockroaches. Then we found fossils of flying insects. Here's the fossil of there's the fossil dragonfly, supposedly 380 million years old. What is it? A dragonfly. Now, evolutionists believe something on a non-flying insect evolved into wings. But there's a big argument going on among evolutionists what it was on the non-flying insect that evolved into wings. Why? Because they've never found one single transitional form. You see, if you could find an intermediate between the non-flying insect and the flying insect, you would settle the controversy and you'd win a Nobel Prize. So just go out and hunt for fossil insects, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to be famous. But I don't count on it. You see, here is powerful, positive evidence for creation. The various non-flying insects appear then, essentially as they do now. That is true of the flying insects, and certainly there are no transitional forms. Now the same is true of the flying reptiles. Here we have a pteranodon. Pteranodon is one of the types of flying reptiles. There were others, Rhamphorhynchus, very interesting flying reptiles. All flying reptiles had enormously long fourth fingers. Of course, they had wing membranes and flight muscles and hollow bones. Pteranodon also had a long toothless beak. That means ordinary jaws and teeth had to gradually evolve in that long toothless beak. Some little bony knob had to evolve in that long bony crest and all of that. Now, think about it. Millions and millions of years ago, there was this ordinary land reptile. And then he had a genetic accident, a mutation, and his fourth fingers got just a wee bit longer. Now, for some strange reason, that conferred survival value. And so the reptile with a slightly longer fourth fingers replaced the original after, many generations struggle for existence and all of that, survival of the fittest. He finally replaced the original. So now we had a reptile with slightly longer fourth finger. And then after hundreds or maybe thousands of years, a lot of bad mutation, he had another good mutation. And his fourth fingers got just a wee bit longer again. Struggle for existence, elimination of the original. Now we had again, slightly longer fourth finger. And after thousands and thousands of these genetic mistakes, the fingers got longer and longer and longer and longer. As a matter of fact, the fourth fingers in the pteranodon supported a wingspread up to 52 feet. Longer than the F-4 Phantom jet. I don't know about you, I'm glad that critter is extinct. Not only did the fingers have to get longer and longer and longer, but ladies and gentlemen, remember this. Can you believe it? At the same time, other genetic mistakes created the wing membrane, the flight muscles, the hollow bones, evolved jaws and teeth, and that long toothless beak, and all of that, until we finally had the pteranodon. Now, think about that for a moment. Let us say he's 25% along the way. Now he's got 25% wing and 75% regular reptilian forelimbs. Poor fellow. You see, he can't fly, and neither can he run any longer. He can't escape his predators. He can't catch his prey. He's dragging those useless appendages around. They just, they're certainly no benefit. They're a hindrance. What kind of ridiculous nonsense is this? How would he ever survive? How would the intermediates? Now, once he has wing membrane and there's long fingers and flight muscles and all of that, sure, now he's a flying reptile. But that is a very beautifully designed creature, ladies and gentlemen. And remember this, nothing works until everything works. And he's not going to be a flying reptile until he's a flying reptile. Now, furthermore, if that story is true, we ought to find a few of the transitional forms. We find a goodly number of fossils of flying reptiles. We certainly find plenty of fossils of the non-flying reptile. We ought to find some intermediates. Ladies and gentlemen, we have never found a trace of an ancestor, not even a trace of a transitional form or an ancestor for flying reptiles have ever been found. Just as you see them on the screen, that is the way they are right at the start. I submit that as powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now the same is true for the bats. Bats are flying mammals. You see, we've discussed flying insects, flying reptiles, now the flying mammals, or bats. supposedly the bats evolved from something like a rat or a squirrel, something like that, some non-flying mammal evolved into the bat. The bat is really a remarkable creature. Of course, its fingers are very long, supporting the wing membrane, and he has flight muscles, all of that you see, and he has a remarkable sonar. That is, the insectivorous bats, a small bat, have a sonar system. They use echolocation. In total darkness, they can catch insects. My last trip to India, we went down the beach one evening, Visakhapatnam, and there was a bat, and I was watching that bat up there in the dark, swooping this way and that way, snatching insects in the darkness because of his sonar system. And you could have 1,000 bats or more in the inky blackness of a cave, and they could all fly around and not hit anything. Can you imagine being in a room with 1,000 radios playing at the same time, all on different channels? Just be racket, it'd be noise. You wouldn't hear a thing, you wouldn't understand a thing. But the bat sends out his signal, and he can identify his signal from all those other thousands. And it tells him where the object is, what the shape is, the speed, direction it's flying, and all that sort of thing. Incredible. Well, supposedly all that evolved from a squirrel or who knows what. Well, here's a picture of the world's oldest known bat, taken from the cover page of Science, December 9th, 1966. Dr. Glenn Jepson, the author of the article, said that these fossil bones that we see in the middle of the slide here were found in rocks 50 million years old. And he said nothing related to a bat has ever been found that's any older than that. All right, then, according to Dr. Jepson, this evolutionist, here we have it, the world's oldest known bat. We see the actual fossil bones, the reconstruction of what the bat must have looked like. All right, there he is, the world's oldest known bat. What is he? 100% bat. He's essentially identical with a modern bat. They discovered by studying the skull that he had the sonar system found in modern bats. He appears fully formed. They've never found a trace of an ancestor or an intermediate form. I submit that as powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now the same is true of the birds. Here's Archaeopteryx. Oh, how evolutionists just love to talk about Archaeopteryx. Everywhere I go around the world, evolutionists present Archaeopteryx as evidence for evolution. Look, if evolution were true, there ought to be tens of thousands of intermediate forms. I mean, there would be no doubt about it. There'd be no quarrel. There'd be no dispute. But they always come back to Archaeopteryx. Now, this is just a reconstruction, an artist's conception of Archaeopteryx based upon the fossils. This bird supposedly lived 150 million years ago. We see that Archaeopteryx was a bird. Archaeopteryx had the basic form and pattern of the avian wing. He had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds. He had feathers of flying birds. There is a difference between the feathers of non-flying birds and flying birds. Archaeopteryx had the feathers of flying birds. He flew. And feathers are incredibly complex structures. They develop totally different, in a totally different way than scales of a reptile. They develop from follicles, just like the hairs on our head develop from follicles. So do feathers, totally different than a scale. And Archaeopteryx had bird-like, it had perching feet, had a bird-like skull. You know, they used to say that the skull of Archaeopteryx was reptilian until they dug the skull of the London specimen out of the limestone and studied it. It was bird-like, not reptile-like. Archaeopteryx has a furcula or wishbone. Many other things about this bird have been studied in recent years, and in every case it turns out to be bird-like. This is a bird, it flew, and there are no intermediates between this bird and any reptile. However, it did have teeth, had claws on the wings, and it had a long tail. That, among other things, is supposed to prove that it came from a reptile. Do these features indicate it came from a reptile? Maybe, but maybe not. What about the teeth? Well, it's true that modern birds do not have teeth, but it is also true in the fossil record some birds had teeth and some did not. Well, that's not such a surprise. After all, it's true of all other vertebrates. Some fishes have teeth, some don't. Some amphibians have teeth, some don't. Some reptiles have teeth, some don't. Most mammals have teeth, some don't. Most of you have teeth, some don't. Well, that's not relevant to our discussion, but what is relevant is that the presence or absence of teeth does not necessarily prove anything about ultimate ancestry. But what about the claws on the wings? Well, there's several birds living today that have claws on the wings. Whoop, that's not him. I thought I had a picture of the Hoatzin. The Hoatzin is a bird living in South America. The juvenile Hoatzin has two very nice claws on its wings. The Turako of Africa has claws on its wings. The ostrich has three very nice claws on its wings. No one would suggest for a moment that any of these birds are transitional between reptile and birds, because they are birds very much alive and well today. Fact is, evolutionists believe that flying birds did not evolve from non-flying birds, that is, non-flying birds today, but non-flying birds that we have today evolved from flying birds. I just don't understand why they work so hard to get up in the air and then work so hard to get back down on the ground. Stay there. But anyhow, you see, this thing is a bird, and it appeared fully formed. Now, furthermore, I think this is a real clincher here. Just 2 or 3 years ago, scientists at Texas Tech University found fossils of a bird in Texas, which they claim to be 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. Now, if that's true, it should be practically a reptile. 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. It turned out to be, if anything, more bird-like than Archaeopteryx. They've never found the breastbone of Archaeopteryx, so they assume it had a small breastbone. Most birds have a very large breastbone. The bird found in Texas has a substantial breastbone. Archaeopteryx has solid bones. Well, that's not really too definitive, because some birds living today have solid bones. But that bird found in Texas had hollow bones. And its skull was undoubtedly identical to those of modern birds. So, you see, the evidence was exactly opposite of what an evolutionist would expect or predict, and fully in accord with what a creationist would expect. We wouldn't expect a bird, even, I don't care, even if he really were 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx, and I don't believe it. We wouldn't expect him to be any more reptilian. Birds are birds, you see. And that's what it turned out to be. Now, if we would try to judge this on a scale of about 1 to 10, as far as flight is concerned, we'd have to give it to the creationist about 9.9, maybe 9.95. I think it's powerful evidence for creation. But what about the dinosaurs? Well, dinosaurs, again, are a remarkable testimony for creation. You know, we find fossils of dinosaurs on every continent of the world, from as far north as the North Shore of Alaska, down to the southern tip of South America. They occur in all sizes, shapes, and descriptions, from some as small as chickens to some weighing 100 tons. They had very unique structures, which, if they evolved, would have left an evolutionary history there for us to find. But what we find is remarkably in accord with creation. Here, for example, we see Triceratops, so called because he has 3 horns, one above each eye and one on the snout area. Then he has a huge armor plate here, protecting the shoulder and the flanks here. Those are unique structures. And ladies and gentlemen, Triceratops is Triceratops right from the start. We have a one-horned dinosaur, monoclonius. He's monoclonius right from the start. And other horned dinosaurs, but they're unique and they appear fully formed. There are no intermediate forms showing these horns starting out as little knobs and getting longer and longer and longer and longer. Nothing like that is found. I mean, Triceratops has always been Triceratops. Now here we have Stegosaurus. Notice Stegosaurus has no horns on the head, but he has 4 spikes on the tail. And look at those unusual plates along the neck, back, and tail. Probably heat exchangers, we're not sure. But they certainly are unique. Look at those spikes, 3 feet long, about 6 inches at the base. Very substantial structure. If they evolved during millions of years of time, there'd be a whole series of intermediates. But we've never found one. Not one. No intermediates for the spikes or for these plates. Nothing like that has ever been found. Now here's a duck-billed dinosaur, a trachodon. Trachodon stood 18 feet high. Quite a substantial fellow. And we see the huge duck bill of the trachodon. Jaws and teeth, that is ordinary jaws and teeth, supposedly evolved into a duck bill. And the duck-billed dinosaurs, we have numerous fossils. There are many different kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs, some with odd structures on their head. Surely if they evolved, we'd find many intermediates. Here's old bonehead, Corythosaurus. Notice that they did have teeth, but back in the back part of the duck bill. Then we have Parasaurolophus. Look at that unique structure on the head. Very unique structure. Many fossils. Not one single transitional form has ever been found. On this slide, well, I do declare, ladies and gentlemen, obviously that's not a dinosaur. I didn't intend to show that slide. Picture my grandson. Real cute little boy. I don't know how it slipped in there. Now, all the kids can tell you what that is. Of course, that's Tyrannosaurus rex. He had jaws 6 feet long and teeth about 6 inches long. No wonder they call these critters dinosaurs. Dinosaur means terrible lizard. Now, I assume that Tyrannosaurus rex ate meat. He certainly was equipped for it. Now, maybe he didn't start out that way, but he probably ended up eating meat. You know, some creatures that have fierce teeth, you just swear they eat meat, but they don't. Gorilla, look at the teeth of a gorilla. Those huge canine teeth. He never eats meat. He's a herbivore. And some fruit-eating bats have teeth. Boy, it sure looks like he's tearing flesh with them, but they're just fruit eaters. And so we don't know what these things ate in the beginning, but probably ended up eating meat. At least he was equipped for it. No intermediate form. What about these huge plant eaters? Diplodocus. Look at the man standing in front of this dinosaur 100 feet long. Called Diplodocus, which means double-beamed. Long neck and long tail. And then we have the great Brontosaurus. That is, he was named originally Brontosaurus by O.C. Marsh, I believe of Carnegie Institute. It turned out he put the wrong skull on it. And when they got the right skull on it, it turned out to be the same as another dinosaur called Apatosaurus. So today, they call this creature Apatosaurus. I still call it Brontosaurus because the kids all know the name Brontosaurus, and I like the name. The name Brontosaurus means thunder lizard. You see, the ground must have thundered when he walked by, and so they called him the thunder lizard. He was weighed 40 tons, 75 to 80 feet long, a huge plant-eating dinosaur. Then the largest dinosaur of all was the great Brachiosaurus. He stood as high as a 5-story building, up to 50 feet high, weighed up to 100 tons. A huge plant-eating dinosaur. And a very unusual anatomy. His nostrils were not located out on the end of the snout, but were in that bony dome on the top of the head. Very strange arrangement. Nobody knows why he had that strange arrangement. But this one thing we do know. We've never found a transitional form showing the nostrils migrating from the snout into the bony dome on the top of the head. Nothing like that has ever been found. Brachiosaurus is Brachiosaurus. Brontosaurus is Brontosaurus. Diplodocus is Diplodocus. Not a single intermediate suggesting that these big fellows evolved from some little fellows. That's true of every dinosaur there is. I have a book called The Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs. I searched through that book to see if there was any suggestion for a transitional form, and there were none. Tremendous, powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now, very briefly, let us consider the origin of man. We need to spend about an hour and a half on this subject alone. We should spend about another 15 minutes. This is the idea that the evolutionists have, that millions of years ago there was a common ancestor of modern apes and man. They've never found fossils of that common ancestor, strictly hypothetical. They're still looking for him, but they believe that he existed. Then some of these individuals got over here somewhere and isolated and began an evolutionary line that led down to modern apes. Some of the same population got over somewhere else and became isolated, and they began an evolutionary line that led down to man. Now, how you can start with the same creature and end up with apes on one hand and man on the other, I don't know, but that's what they suggest happened. Now, once the split took place in the line leading to man, evolutionists would call all of those creatures hominids. That is, they'd place them in the family of man, the hominidae. Today, there's one single species in the family of man, the hominidae. That's you and I, Homo sapien. We believe there's never been more than one single species. The evolutionists believe there must have been hundreds and hundreds of different species because it took millions of years for that ape to evolve into man, you see. Here are just a few suggestions of what the intermediates may have looked like as the ape gradually became erect, his brain became larger and larger, and his teeth became smaller and smaller, and other changes took place. So they looked for these intermediate forms. Now we have only time to discuss one, a creature that has been the central figure in human evolutionary schemes for many years, scientifically called Australopithecus. That means southern ape. First discovered in South Africa in 1924 by Dr. Raymond Dart. He claimed that this creature, although it was very ape-like, he claimed that the teeth were somewhat man-like, so it's on its way to becoming people. Throughout Africa, then, other fossils have been found of these Australopithecines. Here we see some of the skulls. This is the skull found by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. They called it Zinjanthropus. It turned out to be Australopithecus. And we can see that it's very ape-like. It has a sagittal crest or bony ridge across the top of the skull, very typical of the ape. No forehead, very flat head, massive eyebrow ridges, massive jaws and teeth, very typical of the ape. But again, Dr. Leakey claimed the teeth were somewhat man-like. And more recently, Donald Johanson, American paleontologist, has found fossils of similar creatures in Ethiopia, to which he gave the name Australopithecus afarensis. One of the fossils was of a female, about 40% complete. He called her Lucy. And everybody immediately assumes it's human or must be semi-human. Why would he call it Lucy, you see? Well, Lucy has the jaws, the teeth, the face and brain of an ape. But Johansen claims she walked upright, just like you and I. Her brain is less than 1/3 of ours. All these ape-like characteristics. But he claimed on the basis of the structure of the knee joints and so forth that she walked upright in the human manner. And that is the consensus of evolutionists today. That these creatures, although they were very ape-like, they walked erect in the human manner. That's what you read in your textbook. It's what you see in National Geographic. Let's see if we have yet. Here's a picture from one of the Time Life publications. This is from their book, The Missing Link. And they show these Australopithecines, hairless, walking around like that, carrying tools and so forth. And it says, here, you see how Australopithecus looked in his savanna hunting ground 2 million years ago. Notice that he is not pictured as the hairy ape once supposed. This is just one of the incredibly lifelike photo paintings that make The Missing Link so informative. End of quote. There you have it, in living color. How can you doubt it? I mean, our children look like something like that? Why, of course. They're certainly not humans. But boy, they're sure walking around like you and I. That's the idea. But not all people believe that. And some of those scientists who don't believe it are evolutionists. They're not creationists. Maybe they would visualize it looking something more like this. This is an artist's conception of Australopithecus, one artist's conception, as the hairy ape. And he has a sagittal crest and no forehead, very flat, massive eyebrow ridges, very typical of the ape, except the artist gave him the eyes of a philosopher. And that helps you. Well, there's some leading scientists in this field that do not believe that these creatures walked erect. One of those is Lord Zuckerman. Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham in England, the medical school. He was first knighted for his distinguished scientific career, became Sir Solly Zuckerman, later raised to the peerage. Lord Zuckerman had a scientific team, which rarely numbered less than 4, that studied these creatures for more than 15 years. And he was studying fossils of creatures that are supposed to have been 1 to 2 million years more recent than Lucy, younger than Lucy. So if anything, they should be more man-like than Lucy. Lord Zuckerman says that his research showed that these creatures did not walk upright, and they were not intermediate between ape and man. One of his former students, Dr. Charles Oxnard, is now professor of anatomy and director of graduate studies at the University of Southern California Medical School. He studied particularly the postcranial skeleton, the part of the skeleton below the skull. He studied the foot bones, the leg bones, the knee joints, the pelvis, and all other parts of the skeleton of these creatures. He has used the most sophisticated methods of anatomy available, multivariate analysis and other methods, which requires computerized analysis. And all of these results, according to Dr. Oxnard, shows that these creatures did not walk upright. They're not intermediate between ape and man. They're not ancestral to man. They're not ancestral to modern ape. They're apes, but not ancestral to anything living today. Certainly not ancestral to man. Now, these scientists are the best scientists, I believe, that anybody in the field. They just didn't throw these things out on the table and eyeball them and make all these judgments. That's the way Johansen did his work and others who worked with him. These people used very, very sophisticated methods. And their conclusions were, these creatures are not our ancestors. They're not intermediate between ape and man. They didn't walk upright. I believe that Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Oxnard, and others who hold those views have done the very best research. Evolutionists don't like what they're saying. They'd rather believe what Johansen says or what Dr. Louis Leakey believes. But they've done the real research. And ladies and gentlemen, if you throw these creatures out of the family tree of man, you just don't have much left. There's just not much after that, you see. Well, here's Piltdown Man. Back in 1912, in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England, they found some fossils, fragments of a jaw and fragments of a skull. And the jawbone appeared to be very ape-like, but the teeth appeared to be rather man-like. The skull appeared to be very man-like, but these bones appeared to be very old. They said they were 500,000 years old. And the fellow who found them, Charles Dawson, an amateur paleontologist, and Sir Arthur Smith Woodward at the British Museum, working together, they put all of this together in a single individual and said that he incorporated ape-like and human-like characteristics in the same creature. So he was a subhuman ancestor of man. He became known as the famous Piltdown Man. And many books and pamphlets were written on Piltdown Man. The consensus of the world's greatest authority, Piltdown Man was our ancestor. Until 1950, when he was shown to be a hoax, a fraud. Someone had taken the jawbone of a modern ape, a human skull, had doctored them up with chemicals to make them look old, filed the teeth to make them look man-like rather than ape-like, planted them in the gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. It's incredible how many ape-like features they could see in that human skull and how many human-like features they could see in the ape's jaw. They weren't there at all. They thought they were seeing it because they wanted to see it, because they wanted to believe it. But it was just nothing but a fraud. Now, in 1922, a single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska. Very exciting discoveries to some of the evolutionists of that time because it seemed to incorporate certain features intermediate between ape and man. And they called this creature Nebraska Man. And the Illustrated London News in 1922 published a picture of Nebraska Man based upon the descriptions of the scientists. We see in the next slide, here's the picture of Nebraska Man, there's the picture of his wife, and there's the picture of the tools they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? Well, a few years later, they found some additional remains of this creature. He turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. It was nothing more than a pig's tooth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my apologies to any evolutionists in the crowd, but I think this is the case when evolutionists made a man out of a pig, and the pig made a monkey out of the evolution. But now, these scientists were good scientists. Henry Fairfield Osborn, W.K. Gregory, and people like that, honest, hardworking, good scientists, but they were seeing something that wasn't there because they wanted to see it, because they expected to see it. See, the powerful influence of preconceived ideas, especially in this area of human origins. Here's Neanderthal man. There's one of the early museum exhibits of what they believe Neanderthal man looked like. They found some fossils of this creature beginning in 1860. Eventually they found other fossils scattered throughout Europe and northern Africa, Israel. 1908 they found a nearly complete skeleton. And from the appearance of that skeleton, it looked like this creature, these creatures could not walk erect. They sort of shuffled along like, we don't have that today because we have vitamin D in our milk, in our butter, and so forth and so on. But they did get possibly other pathological conditions. They have concluded today that all of these so-called primitive features were not genetic. They were pathological. And they have upgraded Neanderthal man to Homo sapien. This is a picture of Neanderthal man that I obtained from the American Museum of History a few years ago. This is a modern version of Neanderthal man. Homo sapien. He was man, you see. About 30 years ago, there's an article by a couple of scientists about Neanderthal people, and they said, now really, if you take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath, put him in a business suit and place him on a New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, that was 30 years ago. Of course, today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or haircut, would you? Some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath. Well, you see, he was not our ancestor, was he? You see, he was man. Might have been our ancestor, but he wasn't a subhuman ancestor. And neither was Piltdown man. He's just an ape's jaw and a human skull. Neither was Nebraska man. He was just a pig's tooth. And a few years ago in Spain, they found a skull cap. They called him Orce man, O-R-C-E, from the village where he was, nearby where he was found. And these Spanish authorities sent out 500 letters all over Europe. Come to a symposium. We're going to study this famous fossil, the skull cap of the oldest human fossil ever found in Europe. Until some French authorities said it's most likely the skull cap of a 6-month-old donkey. And so out the window went Orce man. Now you see, the family tree of man is a very slippery tree. You stick an ancestor up there and he just falls out, or he slips down. He gets kicked out. You see, I'd have to agree with Lord Zuckerman. Lord Zuckerman was an evolutionist, not a creationist. He did his homework. He searched for man's fossil ancestry for many years. But in a book he published in 1970 called Beyond the Ivory Tower, Lord Zuckerman said, page 64, he says this, if we exclude absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's a considered judgment of this church. No bias toward evolve. There's no evidence. In the fossil record. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's a considered judgment of this church. No bias toward evolve. There's no evidence. Now, in closing, by courtesy, you see, ever since Darwin, we've been told that man evolved from an like creature. That's what we've been told. That's what we've been told. Would you be? And the last year or so, a number of scientists have said the reverse is true, that apes people. Scratched his head and said, evolved from the apes, and other evolutionists looking at exactly the same evidence says the reverse is true. Well, I thought I'd better get a second opinion. Now, I know you're not going to believe this, but I went down to San Diego Zoo and I talked to this little baby. You came from people that may have looked like me. What do you think about that? Let's see what kind of reaction we got from that little fellow to that suggestion. Well, you see, it was an astounding notion to him. His hair stood on end, his eyes popped out, and he said, "Hey, no way, fella. No way did I ever come with anything that looked like you." So I went over and talked to this old chimpanzee, and I gave him a book on human behavior, and I had him read that first. I said, "Hey, old fellow, some evolutionists saying that you came from people who act like that." Well, let's see what kind of reaction we got there. Well, he's reading this book on human behavior. When I told him that, you can see it was very grim news to him. Again, come from anything that act like that. I came from people. And I don't believe that people came from apes. Some of my ancestors may have hung by the neck, but I don't believe any of them ever hung by the tail. Man, monkeys, and apes are each special creations. We were not created in the image of an ape. We were created in the image of God. And we have been separate and distinct from the apes and monkeys right at the very beginning. So when we look at this evidence, ladies and gentlemen, and evolutionists, some evolutionists have said, look, this is the general characteristic of the fossil record. All of the major types of plant animals appear distinct and separate without any transitional. And the spatial explanation is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and all living organisms. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is question and answer period at 9:30. It is now 9:34. A modern miracle has just taken place, ladies and gentlemen.